service in July of 2023 when he was nominated as the first Chief Innovation Officer for the state of Connecticut. Fast forward to November of 2023, Governor Lamont tapped him. He said, "You're so good, I want you to stay and I want you to be the commissioner." He was quickly ratified by the General Assembly, and I will say he brings passion and advocacy to rebuilding our economic competitiveness and creating vibrant cities and communities. Prior to that, he was a technology investor for 25 years, investing in high-growth, innovative companies in software, consumer, and fintech markets. He's an educated man, I'll tell you, and this is where I get to say park the car at Harvard Yard, my Massachusetts accent, and graduated with an MBA with high distinction. He's a Baker Scholar from Harvard University and earned his AB from Brown University, where he heads up the Leadership Council. Dan, I want to thank you. You've been a great friend to our valley and to our state, and we're so delighted that you're here today to share the big picture of what's happening in the great state of Connecticut. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan O'Keefe.
You know, by the way, I like to walk when I talk. Can everybody hear me okay if I do this? Is that okay? It'll bore you a lot less, it'll bore me a lot less. It'll be way more interesting. You're already gonna look at this the whole time. You may as well have a little bit of dynamic movement while you stare at my face. First of all, I want to thank Bill for the kind introduction. It is always overly gratuitous. I blush as you do so, but his partnership has been so important for some time now, and I'm always happy to come up and talk to this community. I also want to thank Mayor Loretti. I think he scooted out, but saying I'm doing a pretty good job is high praise from Mayor Loretti for those that know him, so I'll take that as a win. And where's Dominic? Does he just sing and leave? Is that like how that works? Yeah. Holy shit, man. I do a lot of speaking. I want to like bust through the wall and like come out and talk to you guys. That was absolutely incredible. It's not what I was expecting as I started this day. So what I wanted to talk to you today is just a little bit about what we're seeing across the economy in Connecticut. I'll spend some time talking about economic strategy, you know, kind of what we're seeing, where I would argue our relative strengths and weaknesses, opportunities lay, some of the things that we're doing within the state of Connecticut to try to invest against those trend lines and those strengths. And then I'll close also with some things that are challenges for us. You know, every economy has challenges, things that we're trying to work through, and like any state, we have our own. But I'll kick it off just by first talking a little bit about the state economy and kind of what I'm seeing. You know, I'll start with backdrop. You can't build a house, you know, you guys are in the commercial real estate business, you can't build a house without a solid foundation. And, you know, we went through a relatively tough period. For those who were here for the years post-global financial crisis, this is the 2008-2018 time frame, and we went through a tough decade. I mean, it's literally referred to as the lost decade. And there was really a couple challenges. The first is global financial crisis hit us incredibly hard. You know, we're over-indexed towards finance and insurance. Many of our industries got hit particularly hard by the global financial crisis. And then we had this challenge, which is what they described accurately as a permanent state of fiscal crisis. We did the thing we all know you're not supposed to do. We spent the money in the good years, and in the bad years, we point fingers and complain and say what the hell just happened, and we cut programming. That's no way to manage any of our houses, any of our businesses, certainly not the way to manage a state. Fiscal guardrails have been in place since 2017, reset the table on this. It's super simple. We don't spend more money than we have. That's it. And because of that, we've now had 6 years of consistent budget surpluses. End of this year, we'll have paid down our unfunded pension liabilities by $10 billion. Every credit rating agency has increased the rating on our debt. That's just really, it's reset the table in a couple of ways. The first is that's all free money, right? We now have maxed out our rainy day fund at $4.2 billion. That money is now producing income for us. I joke with my teenage daughters, compounding interest is the 8th wonder of the world. Right. Don't spend money, save, because it compounds and it grows. That's free money. We're now benefiting from that in the state of Connecticut. And it also benefits us because we've gone from that concept of a permanent state of fiscal crisis. And now what we have is a predictable underlying environment. Our business leaders know that we're going to manage our fiscal responsibilities as we should. And that's created an environment now which I think is way more constructive for investment. When I talk about things like paying down our unfunded pension liabilities, that's paying down the mistakes of our past. We had to do it, don't get me wrong. Those have been building since the late 1930s. But it now gives us a lot more flexibility on what we can do with our economic system. So with that flexibility, we do things like we're able to pass an historic tax cut, and a tax cut that went to some of our neediest constituents. We're able to start to think about ways to now more fundamentally invest in our future. And that's one of the things I really want to talk to you about today. So now economic growth. By the way, I have to update this slide because literally this morning at 10 a.m., 2024 data came out. And I'll give you the numbers. So over the last 3 years, 3-year CAGR, our economy has grown 17th fastest in the country. That's faster than any other state in the region. That's the fastest relative growth we've seen in 20 years. By the way, just show of hands, I always like to ask this question. How many folks knew that? How many folks knew we were the 17th Lindy's not allowed to vote because she works for the DCD. Tom's not allowed to vote because he's heard this morning. Nobody does. Prior to the pandemic, we were the 49th worst performing economy in the country. How many folks knew when we were the 49th worst performing? This happens in audiences throughout this state. And I'm relatively new to public service. This is a phenomenon that's really interesting to me. And I'm gonna state the obvious. People pay really close attention when the news is bad. It's really hard to get the message out in a way that people understand when the news is good. And think about it, you're a group that's paying attention. If you're showing up listening to me speak, clearly you're paying attention to what's going on in Connecticut. Imagine the rest of our 3.6 million constituents who actually are still thinking we're still sucking wind the way we were doing coming out of the global financial crisis. And that's a problem for us. As business leaders, as folks focused on investment, commercial real estate, that's a problem for us because skepticism is an economic toxin. If you don't believe that the future will be brighter than the past, you don't invest. You don't hire that person, you don't start that business, you don't buy that piece of equipment because you're not optimistic. And that's why it's just super important for me to get this message out to you. And my request, my hope is that you can now get this message out to others. Because there are real reasons for optimism here, and I want to make sure we are not only understanding it, but also acting on it. This is also, I put this up just because it shows how hard we got hit by the global financial crisis, how hard we got hit by the pandemic. This is jobs data, but we've now, you can see the pace of the recovery since pandemic, and we've now recovered the jobs peak we had in 2008, March 2008, right before the global financial crisis. So what changed? Ours is a $350 billion economy. So for a $350 billion economy to go from 49th worst in terms of growth to 17th best, something happened. And I would argue this did. I would argue the pandemic was the slap in the face our economic system needed. It took us from what was a self-reinforcing negative cycle and has now put us, I believe, on a self-reinforcing positive cycle. Now, when presented with more flexibility on where to live, and that's all this data is, this just shows that people's tolerance for commutes has tripled since the pandemic. We know this. But now with some more flexibility on where to live, you're not necessarily defining your life choice, your residential choice based on a commute. People are now choosing this. When I moved here in 2011, I did not sit down and analyze our GDP trends. I'm a nerd, but I'm not that much of a nerd. These are the reasons why I moved my family here. These are the high quality of living, the high quality of education, high quality of healthcare. These are the things that we all know. These were the soft and fluffy reasons that we know make Connecticut an amazing place to raise your family. But I would submit to you that these are no longer soft and fluffy. This is comparative advantage. Now there is more flexibility, there's more liquidity in where people can live. These are the reasons why people are choosing a state like Connecticut. These are the reasons why Connecticut has become a net beneficiary of these post-pandemic trends. And it's showing up in population growth as well. So it was not just a pandemic blip. Our population has grown every single year since the pandemic. We're the only state in the region that can say that. New York, by the way, has lost over 600,000 people in 3 years. Massive state that can sustain the hit, don't get me wrong, but what was an environment of people leaving the state, GE leaving, this sort of pessimism that was out there in terms of how we all thought about or heard about our state, that has really turned it around in a way that's really quite positive. Okay, so I get the question quite a bit on what we're navigating. I'm going to hit this briefly, but there'll be Q&A at the end if folks want to dig into it more deeply. I'm happy to. What's going on with the federal government right now is a real challenge. And this is not a political statement. I'm not here to make a partisan comment. I'm just telling you that the federal government, federal support for the Connecticut economy is $14 billion, 1-4. Our imports and our exports are a massive portion of our economy. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are now subject to rising protectionism and tariffs. Now, it's my job, it's our job as members of the executive branch to play through that. But the degree of uncertainty that this is introduced into our system has been a real challenge. And I'm nervous about it because when there is uncertainty, as I was commenting on before, that's when consumers get nervous and stop spending. That's when businesses get nervous and stop investing. And frankly, if you combine that with federal spend, GDP is consumer spend plus company spend plus federal spend. If all three of those go down at the same time, we will have a recession. We may already be in. Energy costs continue to be our #1 issue in the state. It's not just the states, the entire region. Our industrial energy prices are 117% higher than the rest of the United States. Again, it's a longer conversation. I'm not going to belabor it here. But if during Q&A you want to dig into some of those dynamics, I am happy to. The DECD does not lead our energy strategy. It's handled by DEEP, our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. That being said, as I've said to my fellow commissioner, if it impacts the state's economy, it is my lane. So I am very focused on this and trying to solve it, but the problems here are quite structural, and it's going to take some real hard decisions to play through it. Housing, we had a session on housing today that's also holding us back. We are, as an administration, putting $800 million into housing stock. That's a 3x increase than we've historically invested in housing. We have, as part of the governor's proposed budget, another $800 million, so that's obviously $1.6 billion invested in housing, so we're focused on it. Artificial intelligence, way there in the back. I'm a tech guy. I come from a tech investing background, so I'm spending quite a bit of time, frankly, resisting regulation around AI. It's not because I don't think there should be regulation around things. It's just, it mystifies me that a state representing 1% of the population wants to be the only state in the region, the first state in the region to regulate a multi-trillion-dollar economic opportunity. Let's wait a little bit and try to take advantage of it before we start introducing state government into the question. Okay, so that was kind of the backdrop. That's the backdrop fiscally, that's the backdrop in terms of what we're seeing in our economy, population trends. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to invest against these trends. First is what we're doing for small business. This is our small business lending program. This is a very successful program, by the way. If you aren't availing yourself, I hope you will. It lends at a fixed rate of 4.5%. So I joke, going back to the advice I give my daughters, you should just take the money and put it in treasuries and make money on the arb. But this is also a program where we're focused on supporting our minority and women-owned businesses. The goal is to be north of 50% towards businesses with those ownership profile, and we're at 64%. It's a very successful program, one we're quite proud of. And partially because of that, I don't want to suggest it's the only reason, but we've seen a significant increase in the growth of new startups. One of the questions I get at times is, is everybody moving to Florida? Is everybody moving to these warmer states, starting their businesses down there? No. That was a pandemic blip. That did happen for 12, 24 months post-pandemic, but that's reversed. You can see Florida all the way in. Their new business startup growth declined year on year. And so what we're seeing is chops not only in the region, but also when you compare to some of those other states. As I think about the way our economy is currently exposed, and I mean exposed financially, manufacturing is 12.6% of our economy, finance and insurance is 14% of our economy. Those are our big sectors. Those are large, important sectors. They matter to me, they matter to us. I'll go through some data on how we're supporting them later. But one of the things I would like us to see when I talk about investing into our future, this is really also investing to where the puck is going. So continuing to support our existing industries, but also starting to think about an environment for new business creation and ways those existing industries can innovate. Make sure they innovate here rather than someplace else. So part of what we're managing is an innovation portfolio. Connecticut Innovations, which is our state's venture capital fund, been around for over 30 years, now self-sustaining, so it funds itself. I love that, right? Because it's basically startups of yesteryear now funding startups of today. We launched an Office of Innovation within the DECD. We're now staffing that up and funding it to really help support an innovation ecosystem, culture of risk tolerance. And then Innovation Clusters is one of our more recent announced programs. It's a $100 million program. We've got 3 finalists. We haven't announced awardees yet, but this is a $100 million program around the application of next generation technologies, things artificial intelligence, quantum computing, in our industries of greatest importance. Again, going back to, we want to make sure our industries innovate here rather than feel like they have to do it someplace else. My CMO makes us put that in there. And so why why Connecticut? Why is Connecticut a place where innovation can thrive? One thing I think a lot of folks don't realize, when you think about innovation, you try to think about startups. But if you look at our higher ed ecosystem, if you look at our large national defense primes, the amount of IP that's being generated by Connecticut, the amount of patent activity is actually pretty incredible. We are a prolific generator of innovation, so we are a natural home for this continued kind of growth. I mentioned manufacturing as being an important sector for us. When I'm speaking to a manufacturing audience, I say it slightly differently. I say if you're wondering whether manufacturing is important to us, it's not. It's existential. And it's existential because so much of our economy is concentrated around manufacturing. And the reason why I think that's so important is we have, if I sat down here today in front of you and said, hey, where do you think you should put a manufacturing cluster? You wouldn't pick the Northeast. It's a high cost region, right? We have a high cost of labor, high cost of energy. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to an obvious place to have a manufacturing cluster. By the way, that's why other states in the region no longer do. You know, if you look at other states around the region, they're declining as a percentage of their GDP, whereas Connecticut is not only high, but is increasing. And so why is our manufacturing sector actually growing as a percentage of our economy in Connecticut? And the reason is two reasons. One, we have a 100-year history of building an incredibly deeply specialized workforce to make very, very complicated things here. We make nuclear submarines here. We make attack helicopters. We make jet engines. By the way, we make photolithography machines. Show of hands. Who knows what a photolithography machine is? DECD can't vote. Okay, usually I get one. This is a little slightly lower percentage of the hands I usually get, which just means you're not nerds, so that's cool. But photolithography machines are the machines that make semiconductors. Fun fact, every single semiconductor in the world, every semiconductor in your pocket, in your phone right now, was made on equipment made in Connecticut. ASML, worldwide leader in photolithography machines. Their North American headquarters is here in Connecticut. So that's why. The reason why it's growing and why it's so important to us is because we have this specialized workforce, so we have to protect it. And we are protecting it. So we have something called the MAA, Manufacturers Assistance Act. Hasn't been capitalized since 2018. In the governor's proposed budget, we have proposed $150 million for that fund to continue to support this incredibly important industry. And here are some of the reasons why manufacturing does lead here. I talked about the specialized workforce, but you can also get a sense just for how we rank in terms of the quality of this particular industry. We continue to do the work around business development. One of the challenges I always have is when a company leaves the state, you get all the headlines. When a company stays or grows here, there is no press release. But that work does continue. One of the perceptions I'm trying to beat out of the system is that it's a high cost of doing business here. It is in terms of labor, it is in terms of energy, don't get me wrong. But it's the 11th or the 7th lowest in terms of businesses' tax burden as a contribution to our overall tax burden. This is not a place where we're anti-business, quite the opposite. We want to really make sure business can thrive here. These are some of the stats that we did in 2023 around business development. Okay, I mentioned I want to talk about some of the challenges we have. So that's the good stuff. That's where we're investing, that's where we're trying to support the economy's growth. We have challenges, workforce is one of them. By the way, every economy should have a job vacancy rate. A functioning economy, this would never be zero. You'll always have people looking for work. But if I look at our job vacancy rate, you can't quite see this probably because it's too small. The good news is we're in line with the rest of the United States. The good news is it's come down quite a bit since the pandemic. The bad news is we're about 1% higher than we were prior to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, job vacancy rate ran about 4%, it's now running about 5%. So we've got some work to do here. We have more jobs than people to fill them. One of the ways you solve that is with incoming population, but we're also investing $145 million in workforce. The governor's established the Governor's Workforce Council to allocate these funds. We're very focused on understanding where the future is going and where our workforce of the future needs to be. I mentioned comparative advantage being those soft and fluffy things you saw. What that basically boils up to is the vibrancy of our communities. You know, making sure our communities continue to be places where folks want to raise their families. That's one of our elements of comparative advantage. And these are some of the investments we're making across our communities. Community Investment Fund, which is an $875 million fund, that's our biggest program. $800 million I mentioned before, now doubling to $1.6 billion going into housing, not DCD, as Department of Housing, but still a historic investment in housing. And then one of my favorite programs, which is Brownfields. Brownfields is taking down this old blight, these old industrial sites, these old mills, these old plants, remediating them, and then making them available and ultimately seeing something amazing come up on those. So you're removing the blight and getting something amazing. And by the way, a lot of these plants, just because they needed access to water, dot our waterfront. So we're also reclaiming our waterfront where we do this work. I'll skip this because I touched on most of it. I'll skip that. This kind of gives you a sense of sort of before and after what these programs can really do in terms of reinventing these communities. And this is what we've seen in terms of housing development. This number, by the way, this is net housing starts. This was range bound for like 15 years. You know, you go all the way back to here. It was still like 4,000 or 5,000. So we were adding to our housing stock, but it wasn't accelerating. And what we saw in the last 2 years was this accelerate pretty dramatically. And I think that acceleration was two things. One was obviously the capital support we've been putting into housing. But I think more importantly, this is optimism. This is optimism coming back into the system. This is developers looking at the same data I'm looking at and saying it's actually a pretty good time to take a bet on Connecticut. We've established something called MRDA, which I thought might be interesting to this group. So CRDA is the Capital Region Development Authority, very targeted investment in the city of Hartford and the surrounding areas. We're now rolling this out statewide to just make sure that we're protecting, this is what I'm talking too long. This is to now make sure we're rolling this out statewide and continue to accelerate this kind of program and this kind of investment across the entire state. With that, and when the guy comes up at the end, I know I've got to sort of wrap. Particularly when he's like twice the size of me. This is when I don't wait. I see the, it's time to wrap. Do we still have time for Q&A or did I eat it all up? 5 minutes maybe? All right, so you have some time for Q&A.